When I finished college, I resided in a small studio apartment within Chicago. It wasn't fancy, just a single room located on the top floor of a 3-story building. I selected it because the rent was inexpensive and its proximity to my workplace was convenient. As a 23-year-old carrying student loans and lacking savings, I couldn't afford to be choosy. The apartment was neat, functional, and, most importantly, it was mine. The only window in the space offered a view over a narrow alley. Directly opposite was another apartment building, nearly identical to my own. The alley was tight, barely accommodating a single car, and received minimal sunlight during the day. Come nightfall, it was completely dark. This rarely troubled me. At that time, I was working late shifts, tending bar at a lounge on the north side. My typical return home was around 2:30 or 3 o'clock in the morning. Then, I'd prepare a quick meal and pass the time on my phone until I drifted off to sleep. One night, about a month after moving in, I observed something peculiar. I had just entered, removed my shoes, and switched on the overhead light when I believed I saw movement across the alley's window. Just a brief flicker, perhaps a curtain twitching. I froze momentarily. However, upon looking again, there was nothing present. The window was dark and still. I dismissed it. Maybe I had startled someone, or perhaps it was merely a draft. The following night, the occurrence repeated. The instant I activated the lights, I noticed the curtain shift in that very same window. This time, I was certain I saw it a hand pulling the curtain back just slightly before letting it fall. The occupant behind it remained unseen. The lights in the adjacent apartment were out. It was merely a thin slice of movement within an otherwise black void. But what truly captured my attention was the fact that I had never witnessed the lights on in that apartment. I had always assumed it was unoccupied. That night, sleep eluded me. I couldn't stop thinking about that attic and the hand. Over the subsequent week, I began paying closer attention. Every night, without fail, the curtain moved within seconds of my turning on my lights. It was subtle, yet unmistakable. It was the same sequence each time. A slow parting of the curtain occurred. I caught a glimpse of the dark space beyond, then the curtain closed once more. I started experimenting. Some nights, I left my lights off and sat quietly by the window. When I did, nothing transpired. However, the moment I switched them on, even just the dim light by my couch, the curtain across the alley shifted. It was evident that someone was observing me. I attempted to rationalize the situation. Perhaps someone simply enjoyed gazing out their window at night, but this didn't explain the precise timing. It didn't account for the way it invariably coincided with my arrival. That seemed too significant to be mere coincidence. I inquired with my landlord about the unit across the alley, and he informed me it was vacant, having been so for months. I pressed him, asking if perhaps someone had moved in recently, but he shook his head. He even teased that I was being overly suspicious. I contemplated calling the police, but ultimately refrained, feeling that reporting someone potentially watching me from a window in an allegedly empty apartment sounded absurd. There was no crime committed, no proof, just an unsettling feeling that intensified each night. Then, one night, things intensified when I arrived home later than usual. Around 4 a.m., the bar had hosted a private event, and the cleanup had extended, leaving me exhausted and not thinking clearly. As I reached my door, I noticed something lodged in the frame. Initially, I assumed it was junk mail or a flyer. However, upon removing it, I realized it was a crumpled note. It simply read, "Hey," penned in ink. My legs grew weak. My first thought was the apartment across the alley. Consequently, I rushed to the window and looked across. The curtain was drawn, and there was no movement. Panicking, I called my friend Jamie. Although she lived across town, she told me to come over immediately. I grabbed a backpack, quickly packed essentials, and left. The next day, I confronted the landlord again. This time, I demanded to see the apartment across the alley. He hesitated, but eventually agreed to meet there with the key. The place was dusty and completely vacant, containing not a single piece of furniture. The walls were bare, and the floor creaked with every step, as if the structure was centuries old. However, in the back room facing my window, there was a single metal folding chair. It was positioned directly in front of the window. Someone had access to an apartment that was supposed to be locked and empty. The police were called, and they searched the premises. I'm fairly certain they took fingerprints, but the investigation yielded no results. The realization that my suspicions were entirely correct, and that I had indeed been watched, sickened me as I wondered about the duration of those silent observations by that individual. I moved out that week. Even today, I have no idea who was watching me, how they gained entry, or how long the surveillance would have continued had I not discovered that note reading, "Hey." I've entertained the possibility of it being the landlord. But ultimately, I had to dismiss that theory because there's no way in hell he wouldn't have gone over there to remove that chair before showing me the apartment. I still dream about that window, and sometimes I awaken in the middle of the night, certain that somewhere, someone is still watching. Story to asterisk: when I was 12 years old, my family relocated to a rural area in Oregon, situated miles from the closest town. We inhabited a substantial tract of land enveloped by dense pine forest. It was serene, quiet, and utterly isolated. The house itself dated back to the 1940s. It featured the classic attributes of an old dwelling, including creaky floors, a creepy attic, and a detached, dilapidated shed positioned approximately 30 feet from the back door. This shed was crammed with tools and debris belonging to the previous owner. My father always intended to clear it out, but never got around to it. For the most part, we steered clear of it. I recall the initial instance I noticed something amiss. It was a weekday night, close to midnight. I was awake, reading with a flashlight concealed under the covers, when I heard our dog, Max, barking frantically. Max was a golden retriever, exceptionally friendly but highly alert. Whenever he barked with such intensity, it signified that something was amiss. I crept out of bed and peered through the window. He was facing the shed, barking into the darkness. The motion sensor light by the back door was activated, casting long shadows across the lawn. I couldn't discern anyone, but Max wouldn't cease barking. I didn't venture outside. I simply observed for a while until he quieted down. Then I retreated. The following morning, we discovered deep boot prints in the dirt between the house and the shed. My father dismissed them, suggesting they were likely left by a neighbor or a transient passing through. But I couldn't shake the thought. Over the next several weeks, Max barked at that shed numerous times. Each time, we looked outside and found nothing, yet the footprints reappeared, and they invariably led to the shed, never away from it. One night, approximately 2 a.m., I awoke to the sound of footsteps on the gravel outside my window. I froze. The footsteps halted, then recommenced, moving towards the shed. I peered through the blinds as the light by the back door flickered on. For just a second, I saw him, a tall man standing beside the shed door. He was clad in what appeared to be a grimy grey coat. His face was concealed by shadows, and then the light extinguished. My heart pounded against my chest as I retreated from the window. I roused my parents. My father seized his rifle and went outside, but the man was gone. The footprints, however, were fresh, extending right up to the shed. This time, my father decided to inspect inside. He unlocked the padlock and pulled the doors open, revealing only rusty tools and old tarps. He installed a new lock and reinforced the doors. For a period, tranquility returned. Then, a month later, Max went missing. We searched everywhere through the woods, along the road, and even inquired with neighbors. He was gone. I was utterly devastated. I clung to the hope that he might return, perhaps having merely become lost in the woods. That night, sleep evaded me entirely. I couldn't stop thinking about the shed, Max, and the man I'd glimpsed. Around 3 a.m., I heard the back door creak open. I arose from bed and crept into the hallway. My father was already awake, holding his rifle. We moved to the back door just as the motion light flickered on. There, standing by the shed, was the man once more. This time, he held something. In one hand, a knife. In the other, Max's collar. Upon witnessing this, I felt as though half my life had been drained, a horrifying weightlessness overcoming me, making me feel faint. My father shouted and raised the rifle, but the man turned and fled into the woods. We contacted the police, who searched the vicinity but found no trace of him. What they did discover inside the shed, however, was nauseating. The floor had been cleared. In the dirt, someone had etched symbols crudely drawn, disturbing images. In the corner lay a pile of bones, presumably animal bones. It grew more disturbing still. Concealed behind a false panel within the shed wall, the officers uncovered a backpack brimming with items that weren't ours. Wallets, watches, and several pieces of worn clothing belongings that undoubtedly belonged to someone else, perhaps multiple individuals. The most perplexing item was a notebook. Page after page contained strange symbols, incoherent rambling, jagged handwriting, and crude sketches of houses, families, and eyes. I believe this was some sort of message intended for us, indicating that he had been watching us, perhaps having observed other families as well. The police confiscated all the items found. That night, while packing to depart, I glanced out my window one final time towards the shed. The police tape fluttered in the breeze, and all was quiet. Yet, just beyond it, perhaps 10 feet into the tree line, I perceived a human face. But the instant I blinked, it vanished. I screamed my father's name in sheer panic, shouting, "He's back!" My father stormed into the room and looked out the window, inquiring where he was. I pointed directly at the shed, indicating he was to the left, near the woods. He rushed to retrieve his rifle once more, then ran outside, screaming loudly while firing rounds into the vicinity. The anger and frustration of being driven from our own home by a deranged, dangerous individual, likely responsible for killing our dog, was palpable. I knew my father wished to kill that man. We moved out days later to a considerably less remote region of Oregon. Story 3 *, in the summer of 2018, my friends and I, Abby, Marcus, his younger brother Tim, Tim's girlfriend Hannah, and myself organized a weekend excursion into the Blue Ridge Mountains. We were all in our early 20s, recently graduated from college and eager to disconnect from the world. We chose a location far off the grid, deep within the national park, where the trees grew densely. The air carried the scent of pine and damp earth, and cell service was non-existent for miles. The first night passed normally. We hiked in with our gear, discovered a clearing by a lake spacious enough for 3 tents, ignited a fire, and prepared hot dogs and marshmallows. We exchanged stories, consumed drinks, and remained awake late into the night observing the stars. The forest silence was calming. It wasn't until the second night that an unsettling feeling began to take hold. Around 11 p.m., we were still seated by the fire, laughing, when Marcus suddenly tensed and pointed towards the woods, asking if we had witnessed the same thing. We all looked, but saw nothing. He insisted he had seen movement of figure ducking behind a tree, perhaps 30 or 40 yards away. Tim attributed it to a deer, but then, 20 minutes later, we heard a distinct snapping of a stick in the same direction. This time, the sound was loud. Abby appeared clearly frightened and stated her desire to retire for the night. The group concurred, and we decided to extinguish the fire. We zipped up our tents and attempted to sleep. That night, I awoke to a sound that continues to haunt me. Breathing emanated from just outside, likely no more than 10 feet from my head. Initially, I believed I was still partially dreaming. However, the sound persisted. I was among for other people, yet the breathing didn't match anyone else's pattern. It could possibly have been one of them stepping outside, but I heard no sound of urination, only the breathing. The breathing also possessed the quality of an older person, someone who might be short of breath due to excessive smoking. I reached for my flashlight but refrained from switching it on. The breathing shifted from one side of the tent to the other. Then it ceased. I waited in silence, as action was impossible. The abruptness of the cessation brought a sense of relief, reinforcing my initial thought that it might have been a friend after all. Eventually, I drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I said nothing. Abby remained silent as well. However, when we gathered for breakfast, Marcus appeared troubled, his expression conveying anxiety as he seemed eager to relay something. He stated that someone had been outside our tent last night. Hannah nodded in agreement, confirming she had heard it too, and adding that whoever it was had walked around the tent more than once, suggesting there might have been more than one person. I questioned the entire group, inquiring if anyone had risen during the night to use the facilities, wondering if what we heard might have been them. Tim replied that he had indeed gone out, but mentioned that around 4 a.m. he thought he saw a figure crouched near the fire pit. We inspected the area and discovered footprints in the ground encircling all 3 tents. However, in a patch where the soil was slightly damper, resembling mud, one of the footprints was unmistakably that of a bare human foot, not shoes or boots. This added to the strangeness of the situation. The prints led into the woods and disappeared. We attempted to make light of it, suggesting perhaps a deranged hiker or a prankster, but it didn't feel like a prank. That night, we remained awake longer, conversing nervously around a significantly larger fire. We kept our flashlights nearby. Around 2 a.m., we heard that dreadful sound, the crunching of leaves in the distance. But this time, there was a voice accompanying it. It was a low voice, too faint to decipher, but undeniably human. Marcus switched on his flashlight, and for a fleeting instant, we saw who it was. A man, completely naked, crouched behind a nearby tree. He scrambled back into the trees with the speed of an animal caught out. We were all utterly shaken. Too scared to even retreat to our tents, we felt safer remaining together in the open. Hannah proposed packing up and leaving, but Marcus and I deemed that a terrible idea. Disassembling camp so late and navigating back to the car would be not only incredibly difficult, but also terrifying, especially with the fear that the man might be following us. That night was the worst yet, perhaps one of the worst nights of my life. I didn't obtain a single second of sleep. I was wide awake, and perhaps that vigilance saved me, or at least my belongings. Several hours later, I heard the distant sound of a stick snapping or a leaf crunching. I whispered, "Please, let it be a deer." A brief silence ensued before a voice emanated from the woods. "I see you guys." It wasn't any of my friends. I didn't know if my friends were awake or had also heard it, but I detected no reaction from them. Consequently, I was too frightened to be the sole one responding. What transpired next was completely unforeseen. I heard my tent fabric shift ever so slightly, prompting me to jolt upright and gaze at the zipper. It was beginning to descend slowly. I began screaming at the top of my lungs, prompting my friends to join in their screams. Whoever was on the other side of my tent presumably fled, though I cannot be certain. What I do know is that we all yelled to communicate through the tents. I zipped the zipper fully shut, and for the remainder of the night, I heard no more breathing or footsteps. I didn't sleep. I watched as the morning sun gradually illuminated the area. At dawn, we packed up all our belongings and departed. The tension persisted on the hike back to the car. At the ranger station, we recounted the entire incident. The ranger listened intently, then informed us that they had received similar reports. Mentions of a man, possibly more than one, living out there. Some claimed they stole items, while others spoke of worse occurrences. We didn't inquire further about worse. We attempted to laugh it off in the car, but the laughter felt hollow to me. I don't believe I could ever go camping again after that experience, particularly following the incident with the zipper.